A man checks into a hotel in Las Vegas at 11 at night, exhausted after a delayed flight, dragging a suitcase behind him and asks the front desk clerk where the elevators are. The clerk points vaguely toward the far side of the building. What should be a 90-second walk turns into nearly 15 minutes, weaving through a casino floor lit like daytime at midnight, past rows of slot machines chiming with the exact same reward tones used in mobile games, past a bar, past a gift shop selling neon lit souvenirs, before he finally spots the elevator bank tucked into a corner with no clear sightline from the lobby at all. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. That layout wasn't an accident of poor architecture. It wasn't the hotel forgetting where convenience should live. Somewhere, years before that building opened, a specific person with a specific job title sat down with blueprints and calculated, deliberately, exactly how far a guest should have to walk past, exactly how many slot machines before reaching the one thing they actually came looking for: sleep. And the strange part is, this same basic principle didn't stay locked inside Las Vegas casinos. It quietly spread into ordinary hotel design almost everywhere, which is why, even at a completely normal business hotel with no gambling in sight, you've probably found yourself wondering more than once why the elevator is never where common sense says it should be. I'm going to tell you why hotels put their elevators in such strange, inconvenient places. And I promise you, the real answer traces back to one of the most studied, most deliberately engineered pieces of psychological architecture in the entire hospitality industry. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to walk you through the actual casino design philosophy, first codified by a man named Bill Friedman, that turned elevator placement into a precise science of forced exposure. We'll break down the concept known as the Gruen transfer, a disorientation strategy invented decades earlier for shopping malls that casino architects borrowed and refined into something even more effective. I'll show you how this exact logic quietly migrated out of gambling floors entirely into ordinary hotel lobbies with no casino attached at all, shaping everything from where the front desk sits to how far you'll walk past a hotel bar before finding your room. And by the end, you'll understand why that frustrating, maze-like walk to your elevator was never a design failure. It was, in an enormous number of hotels, the exact opposite. A design success measured not by how happy it made you, but by how much longer it kept you moving through spaces built specifically to separate you from your money before you ever reached your room. Think of a hotel lobby, especially one attached to any kind of retail, casino, or entertainment complex, not as a waiting room whose job is to get you upstairs quickly, but as a river delta, the wide branching network of channels a river splits into right before it reaches the sea. A delta doesn't move water in a straight line. It spreads it, slows it, forces it through multiple paths before finally letting it reach open water. A hotel lobby engineered around this philosophy works the same way on you. It doesn't want you moving in a straight line from the front door to your room. It wants your path split, slowed, and routed through as many revenue-generating channels as possible before you finally reach the elevator. The equivalent of that river finally reaching the sea. The elevator isn't hidden because the architect made a mistake locating it. It's positioned exactly where the delta's channels were designed to eventually converge, after doing as much commercial work on you as the layout could manage along the way. This philosophy was first formally codified in a specific place, and it didn't emerge from vague industry instinct. It came from one specific person's research, published, studied, and taught for decades afterward. In the 1970s and 1980s, a casino executive and researcher named Bill Friedman spent years studying gambling floor layouts across Las Vegas, eventually publishing his findings in a book that became something close to scripture inside the casino design industry, laying out a set of concrete, testable principles for how physical layout could be engineered to maximize the time and money guests spent gambling before leaving. Friedman's core insight, later formalized into what the industry still refers to as Friedman's design principles, was that a casino floor needed to function as what he explicitly called a maze: low ceilings to create a sense of intimate enclosure, dense winding rows of slot machines with no long sight lines to the exits, and critically, key destinations elsewhere in the building: restaurants, bathrooms, and yes, elevators, positioned specifically so that reaching them required walking through, not around, the gaming floor itself. Friedman wasn't being subtle about the intent. His research explicitly measured how layout changes affected what the industry calls time on device, the average duration a guest spent actively gambling and found that maze-style layouts with obscured, hard-to-reach destinations meaningfully outperformed simpler, more navigable layouts on exactly that metric. Here's the elevator mechanism specifically, and it's worth being precise about how deliberately this was engineered. In a Friedman-influenced casino hotel, the elevator banks serving guest rooms are almost never placed with a direct sightline from either the main entrance or the front desk, and this is not incidental. Friedman's own writing described positioning key amenities, including elevators, at the far end of the gaming floor, forcing every single guest, regardless of whether they had any intention of gambling at all, to walk past hundreds of slot machines, card tables, and often a bar or two, simply to reach the room they'd already paid for. Consider what that means for a guest with zero gambling interest, arriving exhausted after a long flight, wanting nothing more than to reach a bed. That guest still has to physically walk the length of the casino floor, surrounded by flashing lights, chiming reward sounds specifically engineered by slot machine designers to be maximally attention-grabbing, and the visible spectacle of other guests actively gambling because the elevator that would let them skip all of it simply isn't located anywhere near the path a rational, direct route would suggest. The exposure isn't a byproduct of building constraints. Friedman's own published principles describe it as one of the central design goals. This idea didn't actually originate with casinos at all. Casino architects borrowed and intensified a concept that had already been proven decades earlier in a completely different industry. In the 1950s, an Austrian architect named Victor Gruen designed some of the first fully enclosed American shopping malls, and in doing so inadvertently discovered and later intentionally engineered a psychological effect that retail researchers eventually named after him, the Gruen transfer. The Gruen transfer describes the specific moment a shopper who walked into a mall with a clear, focused intention, buy one specific item, run one specific errand, gets psychologically disoriented by the mall's deliberately confusing layout, the absence of clocks, the absence of windows to the outside world, the winding, non-intuitive paths between anchor stores, and transitions from a focused, goal-directed shopper into an impulsive, wandering one, browsing stores they never intended to enter, making purchases they hadn't planned. Gruen himself, later in his career, expressed public regret about how thoroughly this manipulative side of his design work had been adopted and amplified across the mall industry, distancing himself from what his own name had come to represent. But the concept had already escaped his control, and casino architects studying retail design alongside gambling floor research absorbed the Gruen transfer almost wholesale, translating windowless, clockless, disorienting layout principles directly into the modern casino floor, then extending the same logic specifically to elevator placement. Since a lost, disoriented guest wandering longer in search of an exit is functionally identical, from a revenue standpoint, to a lost, disoriented shopper wandering longer in search of the exit doors. Here's a specific historical detail that makes this connection undeniable rather than merely theoretical. Older Las Vegas casinos, many built or extensively renovated during the height of Friedman's influence in the 1980s and 1990s, are famous among architecture writers and longtime visitors for a specific, deliberately engineered absence. No visible clocks anywhere on the gaming floor, and historically, very few visible windows to the outside world at all. Circus Circus and Caesar's Palace, among others, became well-documented case studies in exactly this design philosophy. Casino floors built as enclosed, timeless environments specifically, so that guests would lose track of how many hours had actually passed, since a guest unaware it's already 3 a.m. is a guest who keeps playing and keeps walking that same disorienting path back and forth between the tables, the bar, and eventually, whenever they finally decide to stop, the elevator sitting at the far, hard-to-reach end of that same enclosed maze. There's a further detail from Friedman's own later career worth including because it shows how seriously the industry treated this research once it had been tested against real revenue numbers. After years consulting for casino operators using his maze-based principles, Friedman was later hired directly onto the ownership and design team of a struggling Mississippi casino property, where he was given the rare opportunity to apply his full design philosophy from the ground up rather than simply advising on existing layouts. The property's performance improved substantially enough following the redesign that it became something of an internal case study cited across the casino design consulting world for years afterward, treated as direct empirical validation. That layout alone, independent of any change in game, odds, marketing spend, or customer service, could measurably shift how long guests stayed on the floor and how much they spent before leaving. That single case study is part of why elevator placement, seating density, and sightline obstruction became treated less as aesthetic choices left to an architect's personal taste and more as quantifiable levers, tested, measured, and optimized the same way a retailer might test shelf placement, or a website might test button color, except tested using real gambling revenue as the outcome variable being optimized. This philosophy didn't stay contained inside Las Vegas gambling floors either. It migrated in a somewhat softened but structurally identical form into ordinary hotel design with no casino attached anywhere in the building. And it's worth bringing this closer to something you've almost certainly experienced yourself. Hospitality design consultants have written extensively in trade publications aimed at hotel developers about applying what's sometimes called experiential sequencing to lobby layouts, deliberately routing arriving guests past the hotel bar, past a small retail boutique, sometimes past a restaurant's open kitchen or a prominently displayed dessert case specifically positioned between the check-in desk and the elevator bank, rather than allowing a direct, efficient path between the two. The stated industry justification usually centers on exposure and ambiance, giving arriving guests a sense of the property's amenities, encouraging spontaneous bookings for dinner or drinks later in the stay. The practical effect, regardless of the framing used to justify it, is functionally identical to the casino mechanism. Guests cover more distance, pass more revenue, generating spaces, and absorb more marketing exposure than a straight line from the front door to their room would ever require, all before they've had a chance to set down their luggage. Let me give you a specific comparison that makes this concrete, because the contrast between hotel types reveals the strategy clearly. A roadside budget motel built for travelers who want maximum convenience and minimum friction typically places its office directly adjacent to the parking lot, with rooms accessible via exterior doors requiring no interior lobby navigation at all, because that entire business model depends on speed and simplicity as the primary selling point, competing on convenience rather than atmosphere or ancillary spending. Compare that to a large full-service hotel or resort, particularly one with a casino, spa, multiple restaurants, or extensive retail attached, where hospitality design literature consistently describes the opposite priority, treating the distance between entrance and guest room not as friction to be minimized, but as valuable real estate to be filled with revenue-generating exposure. Industry revenue data on ancillary spending, meaning everything beyond the base room rate, bar tabs, restaurant checks, retail purchases, spa bookings, has grown to represent an increasingly significant share of total hotel and resort revenue over the past 2 decades, and hospitality analysts have directly connected that growth to more deliberate, more research-informed lobby and circulation design, layouts engineered specifically to maximize a guest exposure to purchasable amenities during the otherwise dead time of simply walking from one point in the building to another. The psychology underneath this matters too, because forced physical exposure only works if it's paired with something that actually shifts behavior once the exposure happens. And this is where the research gets genuinely interesting. There's a well-documented finding in environmental psychology, sometimes called the mere exposure effect, showing that simple, repeated, passive exposure to a stimulus, a brand, a product, a specific environment measurably increases how favorably people rate that stimulus afterward, even when no conscious persuasion or explicit advertising is involved at all. A guest who walks past the same hotel bar twice a day for a 3-day stay purely because the layout requires it to reach the elevator has been passively exposed to that bar significantly more than a guest whose room access never required passing it. And mere exposure research suggests that repeated exposure alone measurably increases the likelihood of eventually deciding to stop in, independent of any active marketing pitch delivered along the way. The elevator's inconvenient location isn't simply making you walk further. Over the course of a multi-day stay, it's functioning as a repeated, low-grade advertising campaign, delivered entirely through architecture, with you as the unwitting, repeat viewer every single time you leave or return to your room. Here's a second psychological mechanism layered on top of the first, and it's specifically why disorientation, not just distance, matters so much to this strategy. Research on spatial cognition and decision making under mild confusion has found that people navigating an unfamiliar, disorienting environment experience measurably reduced capacity for deliberate, effortful decision making, defaulting instead to more impulsive, lower effort choices, a state some researchers describe as a form of temporary cognitive depletion. This is precisely why casino floors are built with low ceilings, dense layouts, and deliberately obscured sightlines to exits, since a guest who can't easily orient themselves, who can't glance up and immediately see a clear path back to where they started, is operating with less mental bandwidth available for resisting an appealing slot machine, an inviting bar, or an impulse purchase at a retail kiosk along the way. Straightforward hotel corridors, wide, well lit, clearly signed, would let a guest brain relax into efficient, low effort navigation, preserving mental energy for actively resisting unplanned spending. A maze like, disorienting path does the opposite, quietly draining exactly the cognitive resources a guest would otherwise use to stay focused on their original, simple intention of reaching their room. Let me give you a short scene that captures how this conversation actually happens inside the industry based on patterns described in hospitality, design trade publications, and interviews with casino and resort architects over the years. A resort developer sits down with an architecture firm ahead of a new property's design phase. The architect doesn't open by asking how guests would prefer to move through the building. The conversation centers instead on a projected revenue per available room model and a specific question: how do we maximize the average guest exposure time to ancillary spending opportunities without measurably increasing complaint volume or negative reviews, citing frustration with wayfinding? That balance, maximizing exposure while staying just below the threshold that generates visible guest backlash, is treated as a genuinely calculable design target informed by data from comparable properties, guest satisfaction surveys cross-reference against ancillary spending figures, and in some documented cases, actual foot traffic heat mapping conducted at existing casino floors to identify exactly how much forced detour guests will tolerate before frustration measurably outweighs the additional exposure revenue being captured. The elevator's final position on the blueprint isn't determined by asking which location is most convenient. It's determined by finding the specific point on that tolerance curve where exposure is maximized, just short of guests actively rebelling against it. Now, you might be thinking, surely modern casinos and resorts, especially the newer, more upscale ones, have moved past this deliberately confusing maze approach, since so many contemporary Las Vegas properties now feel bright, open, and easy to navigate compared to older properties. And you'd be onto something real because the industry has genuinely evolved, though not in the direction of abandoning the underlying strategy entirely. Beginning in the 2000s, a competing design philosophy emerged, sometimes called the playground model, associated with newer resort properties that deliberately opened up sightlines, added natural light, raised ceilings, and created more legible, navigable layouts compared to the classic Friedman maze. Properties built around this newer philosophy, including several higher-end Las Vegas resorts developed in the 2000s and 2010s, found through their own internal data that a certain segment of guests, particularly those less interested in gambling and more interested in dining, shopping, and entertainment as the primary draw, actually spent more money in an open, pleasant, easy to navigate environment than they did when forced through a disorienting maze they resented. This shift didn't eliminate forced exposure as a strategy, it simply refined the mechanism, replacing outright disorientation with what design consultants sometimes describe as curated wandering, wide, attractive, well-lit paths that still route guests past the maximum number of retail and dining opportunities on the way to the elevator, just without the low ceilings and confusing dead ends that older guests increasingly resented enough to complain about publicly. The elevator, notably, still tends to sit at the far end of that path in both the old maze model and the newer playground model. Only the mood of the walk between the entrance and the elevator has genuinely changed. Hotels attached to convention centers reveal a slightly different but related version of the same strategy, optimized for a captive audience that isn't gambling at all. Large convention hotels frequently place their elevator banks at the far end of the building, specifically relative to the meeting and exhibition space, forcing attendees moving between their rooms and the conference floor to pass repeatedly through a central atrium lined with the hotel's restaurants, coffee kiosks, and bars, sometimes multiple times a day across a multi-day conference. Hospitality consultants specializing in convention hotel design have written about this pattern explicitly, noting that convention attendees represent an unusually predictable, repeat exposure audience, moving along the same force path several times daily for several consecutive days, making the mere exposure effect discussed earlier even more powerful than it would be for a typical leisure guest passing through the lobby only once or twice during an entire stay. A conference attendee who walks past the same coffee kiosk 4 times a day for 3 days has been exposed to that kiosk 12 separate times before ever making a purchase decision. And convention hotel revenue data has consistently shown ancillary food and beverage spending during multi-day conferences running meaningfully higher on a per-guest basis than equivalent spending during shorter leisure stays. A Gap hospitality analyst attribute significantly to exactly this kind of repeated force path exposure. Airports show the same underlying strategy at work in a closely related industry, and the parallel helps confirm this isn't a coincidence unique to hospitality alone. Airport terminal design, particularly at major hubs built or renovated since the 1990s, has been extensively documented using nearly identical forced path retail routing, funneling arriving passengers through duty-free shops and food courts on the way to their gates, positioning the most desirable retail directly along the single unavoidable path between security and the concourse. Airport revenue researchers and hospitality researchers studying casino layouts have, at various points, cited each other's work because the underlying insight is genuinely industry agnostic. Any environmental where a visitor is temporarily captive, unable to simply leave and shop elsewhere, and required to move through a controlled physical space to reach their actual destination, is an environment where forced exposure and deliberate circulation design can measurably increase ancillary revenue, whether that destination is a departure gate or a hotel room, and whether the goods being sold are duty-free perfume or a nightcap at the lobby bar. So what do you actually do with this information the next time you're checking into a large resort or casino hotel and can't find your elevator anywhere near the front desk? First, before you even start walking, ask the front desk clerk directly for the shortest route to the elevator, rather than simply following whatever direction they point in passing, since staff working the desk daily generally do know a more efficient path even when the building's dominant signage and sightlines are pushing you toward the longer, more exposed one. Second, recognize the disorientation itself as a design feature rather than a personal failure of your sense of direction, because feeling lost in one of these environments isn't evidence you're bad at navigating buildings. It's evidence the building was specifically engineered by trained professionals whose explicit job was making that disorientation happen, and knowing that can genuinely reduce the frustration and decision fatigue the layout is counting on to loosen your spending discipline along the way. Third, if you're staying multiple nights and know you'll be making this walk repeatedly, take a mental note or even a photo of the actual layout the first time through. Since the mere exposure effect, driving repeated impulse purchases depends partly on the walk, continuing to feel passive and automatic each time, and consciously mapping the route. The first time can help you move through it more deliberately, and with less accumulated exposure fatigue on every subsequent trip. Fourth, if avoiding the exposure entirely matters to you, many larger resort properties do maintain a secondary, less prominently signed elevator bank specifically for staff or accessibility purposes that often provides a far more direct route. And asking a bellhop or concierge specifically whether a shorter path exists rather than simply following the main signage will frequently reveal an option the general layout was never designed to advertise. Fifth, if you're traveling with children, elderly family members, or anyone for whom a long, disorienting walk is more than a mild inconvenience, mention that specifically at check-in, since many properties, particularly larger resorts with accessibility obligations, do have documented alternate routes and can arrange more direct access, but rarely volunteer that option unless a guest's specific needs are raised directly, precisely because the default path was never built with minimizing that walk as a priority in the first place. There's one more piece of the modern picture worth understanding because it shows this discipline is still actively evolving rather than settling into a fixed formula decades ago. Contemporary resort design increasingly incorporates real foot traffic data collected through Wi-Fi signal tracking and anonymized mobile location analytics, technology that lets a property's management team see in granular detail exactly which paths guests actually take through a building, where they pause, where they backtrack, and where drop-off and foot traffic suggests a section of the layout isn't achieving its intended exposure goals. Several major resort operators have discussed in industry conferences and hospitality technology publications using this kind of data to iteratively adjust signage, lighting, and even temporary retail kiosk placement between major renovation cycles, essentially running the same kind of continuous behavioral testing that a website might run on button placement, except applied to the physical movement of guests through a building that costs hundreds of millions of dollars to construct. The elevator's fixed physical location can't be moved without a genuine renovation, but everything around it, the lighting that draws your eye toward a bar instead of a hallway, the signage that makes one path feel more obvious than another, the placement of a pop-up kiosk exactly where foot traffic data suggests guests are most receptive to an impulse stop, continues to be refined using exactly the same underlying philosophy Bill Friedman first codified decades ago, just executed now with a level of granular, real-time behavioral data he never had access to. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. The maddening, meandering walk to your hotel room isn't evidence of bad architecture, and it isn't evidence that nobody designing the building cared about your convenience. In a genuinely significant number of hotels and resorts, particularly anything attached to gaming, extensive retail, or dining, it's the precise, deliberate output of decades of research into exactly how far a human being can be routed off their intended path before frustration outweighs the additional exposure being captured. Research that started on casino gambling floors, borrowed its core disorientation principle from 1950s shopping mall design, and has since been refined, softened, and quietly exported into hotel lobbies that don't have a single slot machine anywhere in the building. The elevator was never lost. It was placed exactly where decades of layout research suggested it should sit, at the far end of the most profitable path the building could route you through. And the fact that you've never noticed the strategy at work is, from the perspective of the people who designed it, the strategy succeeding exactly as intended. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. Elevator placement in large hotels and casinos traces back to a formally codified design philosophy, most associated with researcher Bill Friedman's work on Las Vegas gambling floors, which explicitly treats key destinations like elevators as tools for maximizing forced exposure to revenue-generating spaces, not simply as functional infrastructure to be located wherever convenience would suggest. 2. The underlying disorientation mechanism didn't originate in casinos at all. It was borrowed and intensified from the Gruen transfer, a shopping mall design principle from the 1950s, proving that confusing, clockless, hard-to-navigate layouts measurably shift visitors from focused, goal-directed behavior into impulsive, wandering behavior more susceptible to unplanned spending. 3E. This strategy has migrated well beyond casinos into ordinary hotel and resort design, and even evolved into a softer, more pleasant-feeling version in newer properties. But the core goal, routing you past the maximum number of paid amenities on your way to the one thing you actually came for, has remained remarkably consistent across every era of hospitality design that studied and adopted it. The next time you find yourself wandering a hotel lobby, exhausted, dragging luggage, wondering why on earth the elevator is nowhere near the front desk, you'll know exactly what you are walking through. Not a building that failed to plan its layout sensibly. A building that planned its layout with extraordinary precision, just optimized for a goal that was never actually your convenience in the first place. If this changed the way you look at your next hotel lobby, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.